There is much still unexplained in this world. Many age-old tales of creatures hidden in the dark corners of human history. Bloodsuckers, shapeshifters. Today we dismiss them as myth, vampires, werewolves, the stuff of science fiction and horror movies. But what if there is something behind all these stories? What if these creatures are real?
I know for a fact, because I am a werewolf, that werewolves exist. If werewolves exist, then vampires must exist too.
We'll explore the dark side of history to find out where vampires and werewolves may have come from.
In the history of Transylvania was a really, really bad guy. Vlad the Impaler.
And discover through eyewitness accounts what they're reported to be like.
Werewolves didn't just bite you, they ripped you to shreds.
We'll use the latest scientific techniques to try to understand how these creatures might function.
What is the biology of an animal that actually survives in blood?
And we'll encounter modern-day members of the vampire and werewolf subcultures, those who can shed some light on the reality of the undead.
It's very hard to go to a bar and just shut up someone and go, oh, by the way, do you bleed nicely?
Look closely at the person sitting next to you. Are they really what they seem? Or could they be members of a secret underworld, an actual werewolf or vampire?
I looked up and I saw a tall, dark figure, and all of a sudden, it just wasn't there.
This is a journey into the shadows as we probe the reality of Fang versus fiction. Most of what we know, or think we know, about werewolves and vampires comes from movies and novels, the realm of fantasy. We dismiss these creatures as colorful figments of our imagination, or frightening characters in our nightmares, and nothing more. But werewolves and vampires have been reported in nearly every culture. Stories from separate continents and time periods are eerily similar, and sightings persist today, from the mountains of Eastern Europe to the hidden corners of America.
Our records of vampires go back as far as we have records. In the ancient Greek times, ancient Middle East, there are stories of vampires that emerge as soon as we started writing down things.
J. Gordon Melton is the author of the Encyclopedia of the Undead.
In Japan, the vampire character is called a kappa, Romania, Moria, whereas in Greece, Verolokos.
Idea of the vampire goes back as far as anybody knows, to the dawn of our written history in any event.
Daniel Cohen has written several books about these creatures.
In that you have a spirit or a being out there that sucks the life out of people.
Another legend as old as humankind tells of the ability of someone especially gifted, or cursed, to transform themselves into a wolf. Brad Steiger wrote the Werewolf book. He has spent a lifetime studying the phenomenon.
The concept of shape-shifting is universal. There's not a culture that anthropology can name where shape-shifting does not occur.
In northern Thailand, there is the Tor. In Navajo culture, the Skinwalker. In Italy, the Benedanti. As for vampires, one of the earliest tales dates to the Babylonian civilization, thousands of years ago. The Edimu was said to be a troubled soul that could not rest. It wandered the earth searching for victims whose veins it sucked. The Babylonians also took care not to offend the demon, Lilitu, who was called Lilith by the ancient Hebrews.
Lilith is, in apocryphal lore, Adam's first wife. And because of disappointment in love, was turned into a creature an angry spirit that killed children.
She is the succubus that seduces young men as they sleep. She is the vampire that takes the breath of young babies and adults as well.
One of the first recorded instances of werewolfism in Western history involves a ruler described in Greek mythology, King Lycaon of Arcadia.
The big story of the werewolf goes back at least to Greek times, the story of King Lycaon, who Zeus visited him in human form and Lycan had the very bad taste to serve him human flesh at a banquet, which, you know, Greek gods got rather fussy about that sort of thing. He changed him into a wolf. That's the original lycanthrope.
In honor of Lycan, scientists name the syndrome lycanthropy, and modern-day werewolves are often called lycanthropes, or lycans for short. Early descriptions of the condition date back to 700 AD.
By the time you get to the Romans, there are werewolf stories about, you know, somebody seeing his friend change into a wolf and then be wounded, and then he found his friend later in a human form with the same wound on it. These stories are common in Roman times, almost, and they have a very modern ring to them.
The term werewolf itself comes from the Old English word for man, ver. It may have been coined by early travelers to Ireland, who insisted that they had met entire families of werewolves and witnessed individuals transform themselves into wolves.
At the time of St. Patrick, you know, that he didn't drive out the snakes, he drove out the werewolves. And there were many accounts that Ireland was the land of the wolves.
Elsewhere in Europe, stories circulated of corpses rising from their graves at night to prey upon the living. Villagers at the time reported opening caskets and finding preserved bodies that seemed to be in perfect health.
Sometimes when they uncovered the body after several months, it looked just as alive as it had been when it was buried. The flesh was still there, the color was still there. There might even be fresh blood on the mouth area. Hair would seem to have grown, the nails would have grown, and there was an understanding that maybe this body was still somewhat alive.
British chroniclers named this type of living dead cadaver sanguisicus, Latin for blood-sucking corpse.
Maybe it had gotten up and walked around, and maybe this blood didn't come from the inside, but this creature had been drinking blood.
Yeah, from Britain there are a number of tales of blood-sucking or at least, you know, very dangerous corpses that will, you know, get up and chase you around and so forth.
By the 14th century, vampirism was widespread, especially in the mountainous regions of Eastern Europe. Hungarians called a restless corpse Nosferatu, which meant the undead, while the Slavs called it upir, from which our modern term vampires derived.
He is a thing that is dead and yet moving. He is, or she is, an animated corpse and being kept alive in this, or be kept animated in this half-life state by blood or by some other essence that they manage to get out of the living.
Romanians in particular have a long history of encounters with the undead. Local villagers still fear the strigoi, an evil creature who sleeps during the daylight hours, flies at night, can change into animal form, and sucks the blood of sleeping children. Vampires must hunt in order to survive. As the Bible says, for the blood is the life. But lycans kill indiscriminately, not just out of hunger. It was said that they would attack whomever was unlucky enough to cross their path.
Werewolves didn't just bite you, they ripped you to shreds. They ate you.
You can't emphasize enough how fearful people really were of the werewolf and of how dangerous it could be.
Medieval scholars studying these creatures concluded that the werewolf could move about during the day, but vampires were restricted to the night.
Certainly by the High Middle Ages, there were stories about times related to vampires, so that at dawn and at dusk and at midday, there were periods where their powers were either heightened or dampened. But overall, they were pretty much confined to the darkness.
As a furor over the undead raged across Europe, the Catholic Church was drawn into the fray. In the late 1400s, Pope Innocent VIII released a treatise recognizing the phenomena of shapeshifters and vampiric creatures.
So what would once maybe have been dismissed as a peasant superstition was now, hey, you know, it's right here. Well, here's what the fathers of the church are saying about this.
With support from the authorities, over the next few centuries, tens of thousands of werewolves and vampires would be unearthed and destroyed. The underworld of the undead would come to light, and a conflict between vampires and werewolves would begin.
Though lycans were fewer in number, the war itself had become more perilous, for the moon no longer held her sway. Older, more powerful lycans were now able to change at will. The weapons had evolved, but our orders remained the same. Hunt them down and kill them off, one by one.
Many cultures report werewolves and vampires existing side by side, but most of our modern-day knowledge of them comes from the wild mountains of Europe.
We now know from our study of history and the history of the vampire and the werewolf that the two are intimately connected, particularly in Eastern Europe.
Certain Eastern European tradition holds that one can only become a vampire after being bitten by one. But how might vampirism really be transmitted? In an attempt to answer ancient questions about the undead, author Catherine Ramsland has turned to 21st century science.
I used the quote from Ben Helsing, "He who is not of nature has yet to obey nature's laws." If vampires could exist, how? In other words, we're in a universe that is run by scientific laws, so what scientific laws would apply to the existence of a vampire? How does a person transform into a vampire? What does science give us that can reveal some of the truths of that?
In her studies, Ramsland has looked at the latest research on DNA.
It doesn't make sense to me that the vampire would only transform at the level of the blood. They really must transform their brain, their cellular structure, how their psychology interacts with their cells.
Each of our traits, from height to hair color, is encoded in our DNA. So presumably something occurs during the transformation into a vampire that affects an individual's DNA, giving them superhuman strength, the ability to survive on blood, and incredible longevity. With their bite, vampires might be injecting a type of DNA that invades cells and rewrites their genetic identity, giving victims entirely new physical and behavioral characteristics.
And for that, I looked at this idea of junk DNA. Junk DNA being something that scientists don't yet understand, that's why they call it junk. Some of it acts in a vampiric way. It sucks off resources from others and reproduces quickly. It's like a virus.
If vampirism is a fundamental part of their DNA, it originally could have been a hereditary mutation occurring in one or more individuals centuries ago.
A warlord who came to power in the early seasons of the 5th century. Just in time to watch a plague ravage his village. He alone survived. He became the first true immortal. He fathered at least 2 children who inherited this same trait.
Some trace the hereditary roots of the vampire condition to the Romanian region of Transylvania. This is the homeland of Vlad Tepes, better known as Vlad Dracula, the model for Bram Stoker's novel. The real Vlad was an actual 15th century overlord, infamous for his bloodthirstiness. Even today, local villagers remember him in song. While the fictional Dracula has warped our present-day notions of werewolves and vampires, there may be clues to the real truth hidden in the novel.
Hey, is there anything in your history having to do with a character called Dracula? Yes.
Nicolae Paduraru is the head of the Transylvanian Society of Dracula.
We know Vlad to have been born in 1431. We believe he was born in Sighișoara.
Vlad was named Dracula after his father, Vlad Dracul.
In Romanian, Dracula means devil.
He was given the title Tsepesh, which means impaler, because of his love for impalement as a means of punishing his enemies. History suggests he had 20,000 captured Turkish soldiers impaled while he looked on from a banquet table.
There's again famous woodcut of Vlad sitting there eating lunch while, you got a whole crowd of his former friends sort of hanging there on these spikes.
Accounts of his cruelty assert that he once invited the poor, sick, and elderly to a banquet in his castle, and after feeding them, boarded up the castle and set fire to it. No one escaped. Other reports from the time describe how Vlad enjoyed drinking cups filled with the blood of his defeated enemies. He was overthrown in 1462 and forced to flee to the safety of the King of Hungary's court. It was there that he met a female relative of the Hungarian king, Matthias Corvinus.
In fact, Vlad married a sister of Matthias Corvinus.
But in order to marry her, Vlad had to convert from the Eastern Orthodox Church to Catholicism. According to tradition, anyone who left the Orthodox Church was believed to become a vampire. Vlad returned to Transylvania in 1474. He was murdered just 2 years later and buried at this monastery on the island of Snagov. But in a vampiric twist, no body was found in his tomb when it was opened. Some believe that today's vampires and werewolves are descendants of the mysterious Corvinus clan.
People ask us, well, do you know what a vampire is? And we reply, yes, we think we know. They say, why don't you publish it? Why don't you put it on the internet for everyone to know? And we reply, because you wouldn't understand.
The sons of the Corvinus clan. One bitten by bat, one by wolf, one to walk the lonely road of mortality as a human. It's a ridiculous legend.
It was during the era of Vlad Tsepesh that a major event in the history of werewolves and vampires is said to have occurred. Gypsy Zanval has extensively researched the history of werewolves.
There was a battle in the year 1412, according to legend. The werewolves and the vampires had a war.
We were slaves once. The daylight guardians of the vampires. I was born in servitude.
Vampires are extremely, by nature, snooty. We are the top of the food chain, blah, 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 and everybody else is beneath us. Werewolves are just men who can turn into animals, so therefore they're pets. They can move our coffins during the day and protect us during the night, but they're just like having a big dog in your yard.
The werewolves mutinied against their status as servants, and a fierce war ensued.
The werewolves were tired of being treated as pets and servants, and literally revolted against the vampire. The wolven clans in America and Europe, still to this day, do not trust or like vampires.
During the Middle Ages, as vampires built their bloody reputations in Eastern Europe, werewolves spread out westward from under their shadow. Fear followed in their wake.
In the 14th, 15th, and 16th centuries, sure, you have real werewolf panics.
30,000 people were condemned as werewolves. Now that's the biggest werewolf epidemic that's been recorded.
According to chronicles from the period, the area around the French town of Dole was especially overrun with werewolves. In 1573, at the height of the frenzy, local authorities put out a bounty for anyone who could catch a werewolf, dead or alive.
I mean, we have the classic scene, from the movies where the villagers are going out with their hoes and their rakes trying to find this beast, and people were being killed.
Where you can't underestimate the real fear that people had of these kinds of creatures.
Just months after this edict, peasants returning from work heard the screams of a child. They found a little girl defending herself against a monstrous werewolf. The creature escaped, but some of the peasants claim they recognized in its face the features of a local hermit named Gilles Garnier. Under torture, Garnier confessed to a series of murders committed while in the form of a wolf. He was promptly executed and his body burned. Another accused lycanthrope, a villager named Peter Stube, was caught across the border in Germany.
There actually became a pressure in certain provinces, in certain localities that, you aren't doing enough to find these creatures of the dark. You aren't doing enough to hunt down the shapeshifters.
As a warning to other werewolves, Stube was punished severely. He was put on the torture wheel and his flesh was pulled off with red-hot pincers. His arms and legs were broken, and finally he was decapitated. To ensure that he would not return from the dead, his carcass was burned to ashes.
And this be a sign to other werewolves and vampires, stay away, we'll get you.
Despite the mass slaughter of real and suspected werewolves and vampires, the creatures managed to escape complete annihilation. Later, some of their progeny are said to have blended in with immigrants to the New World, where they may be continuing their underground war, even today. While we may dismiss them as myth, in reality werewolves and vampires are far from being just the imaginings of ancient history. Sightings continue well into the present, and the reports are far too numerous to dismiss. London's Highgate Cemetery is the centre of Britain's best documented contemporary vampire case. One account comes from David Farrant, who runs the British Psychic and Occult Society.
Reports were coming into the society in late 1969 about a tall, dark figure that had been sighted in and around Highgate Cemetery.
Farrant interviewed several eyewitnesses who claimed to have seen the creature. One was an elderly lady who walked her dog past the cemetery's main gate every night.
As she passed the middle gate, the dog whined and it turned around and it tried to drag her back down the lane. Then she looked up and she became aware of a tall figure with red eyes inside the main gates of Highgate Cemetery. And of course it petrified her and she couldn't leave quickly enough. Another person that I interviewed was a 40-year-old accountant whose name was Thornton. He said that all of a sudden he became aware, he sensed something behind him, and he said, his actual words to me were, it seemed to be trying to drain him of energy. And all of a sudden, it just wasn't there.
As local residents became swept up in the hysteria, Farrant began searching the cemetery for hard evidence. Eventually he found himself face to face with the creature.
I suddenly became aware of something out the corner of my eye. And I looked up and I saw a tall, dark figure. It must have been around 8 feet tall. But I wasn't sure if it was or not. It was floating off the ground because the bottom of it just seemed to disappear into impenetrable blackness.
The air surrounding Farrant turned ice cold, and he felt himself transfixed by the creature.
I mentally repeated a Kabbalistic incantation, which is used to repel evil forces. And all of a sudden it just wasn't there, and the temperature returned to normal.
Undeterred, Farrant returned to Highgate the next night to find and expel the vampire.
I was actually carrying a stake. It was a pointed stake, and it was engraved with magical symbols. I was also carrying a cross. But that ceremony, or that attempted ceremony, got interrupted by the police. I was taken to court and charged with vampire hunting. Well, actually, that's not technically correct, because you can't be charged with vampire hunting. It's not illegal.
Farrant was formally charged with trespassing, and the cemetery was closed to the public. While he never encountered the vampire again, reports of strange dark figures haunting Highgate at night continue to this day.
That is the only time in my career that can honestly say I've ever seen anything like that.
Modern reports of the undead are by no means restricted to the old world. Accounts come from across the Americas, including Texas, New Mexico, and of course, Louisiana. where some believe vampires made their first appearance on this continent. Author Kozeluh Smith gives vampire tours of New Orleans.
It wasn't really until the 1700s that the vampire hunts started in areas like France, and New Orleans was being settled right about that time.
According to legend, vampires were brought to New Orleans in the 18th century by women who lived at a Catholic convent.
These ladies were called casket girls because they came to this country with large wooden boxes that resembled coffins. It is our vampire folklore that suggests that these women are responsible for bringing the vampires over in those coffins.
Vampire reports continue to be part of New Orleans history.
There's newspaper accounts of witnesses seeing a dark figure hovering over a body that disappeared, and to put it in the exact words of the eyewitness, as if he had wings.
But if you venture outside of the city and into the surrounding swamps and bayous, you begin to hear stories of another creature. The legendary loup-garou is described as a tall, hairy beast with a canine-shaped head.
The conception of the loup-garou was, of course, an individual that had been transferred into a wolf-like creature, not necessarily a traditional wolf, as we would think of one. The loup-garou was very large and stood on their 2 feet, like a human being. They would stand straight up. They had red eyes and long claws and very, very huge teeth.
Before the French and the Spanish got here, there were the Indian legends of the loup-garou, who could walk on 4 legs or 2, who could attack and tear your throat out, or marry your daughter.
The old Cajuns told stories that on the nights of the full moons that the loup-garou would gather around the bayou, and they had what they called the loup-garou balls, and they would get out there and dance. I myself have had 2 sightings, one of which was on a boat in the swamp. We saw the head of some unidentifiable creature sticking up out of the water. There was no wake behind this creature. It was not swimming, it was walking. That made it about 8 feet tall.
Freddie Zalatar was the boat captain that evening. He knows the swamp's hidden corners and animal secrets better than almost anyone. But even he was stunned by what he saw.
We saw this head that looked, my best description of it, is Chewbacca from Star Wars. Furry head, not an animal head, but almost like a human-like, with tons of fur on it. Basically, where these 2 trees curve out is right where we're seeing this thing just disappear in front of 27, 28 people's eyes. Right there. Won't forget that spot.
Creatures matching the loup-garou's description have been reported across the country. One case is located around the town of Elkhorn, Wisconsin.
It was a creature which stood upright, was completely covered with fur, had a canine or wolf-like head, long claws with very long, sharp fingernails.
Author Linda Godfrey worked as a reporter for the local newspaper. In 1992, she began to hear of encounters with what was described as a werewolf lurking around a rural country lane known as Bray Road.
One woman came upon it suddenly while returning home from work late one night, and her headlights of her car hit this thing that appeared to be kneeling as a person would kneel, not crouching like an animal. And it was holding its hands or claws, palms up, with a dead animal of some sort that she took to be roadkill. And as she passed it, she slowed up to look, and it gave her kind of a malevolent stare. Did not seem afraid, just looked right back at her and really frightened her out of her wits.
To date, Godfrey has collected reports of the Beast of Bray Road from over 24 reliable witnesses, and stories still keep coming in.
The eyes are yellow and they're unwavering. It's not an animal that's shying away from you. It's something that seems to want to look people directly in the eye and almost seeks that. And then once it has asserted itself by returning that gaze, then it melts off. It seems to have a very frightening effect on people.
So far, no one's been able to capture the beast, even on film. But there are a number of theories that attempt to explain what it might be.
I've heard from a few of them who believe that the Beast of Bray Road can be explained
in that it is an immature lycanthrope who hasn't learned how to master its transformations. And so that is why it continually is caught being seen by these people.
Cryptozoologists and other researchers continue to collect reports of these creatures around the world. But to get a real sense of how vampires and werewolves might live, you have to venture into the underworld of the undead and come face to face with them firsthand. Vampires and werewolves are more than just figures of fiction and legend. Everywhere around the world, modern-day vampires and werewolves exist on the fringes of society, denizens of a hidden underworld rarely seen by outsiders.
You would never necessarily notice. It can be somebody sitting next to you who's dressed in a business suit and going to Wall Street.
By day, they are accountants, secretaries, lawyers. By night, they transform into creatures of darkness. At least 1,000 actual blood drinkers are estimated to inhabit the United States alone.
And I was involved. I was told numbers into the tens of thousands.
While true vampires remain hidden, two members of the modern-day vampire subculture agreed to come forward to provide a rare insight on blood drinking. But they did not allow their intimate ritual to be filmed. Kozeluh works as a DJ in Amsterdam.
And besides, it's a kind of thing that you still want to keep it discreet and not too much out. Not so much because it's dangerous, but because it's still considered a major taboo in society.
Vampire subculture is elaborately organized. There are households, courts, and havens, vampire nightclubs like this one hidden in an Amsterdam basement. Blood drinkers and their like meet here once a month to socialize and meet potential partners. Mordita Calavera is a member of Kozeluh's haven.
It used to be, as a child, whenever I would see blood, I would go crazy. I would be like, oh my God, and I want to pour it all over my body.
For me, it's a dependency, nothing more than that. Like a very strong burst down to the nape of my neck, taking my brains and going down my spinal column, irradiating very slowly, and then having a more calming effect.
These modern-day vampires have a finely tuned taste for blood.
Vegetarian non-smokers. They got the cleanest blood. Try tasting blood with nicotine and you'll find out something very unpleasant about it. It's like somebody put a nicotine patch in your beer. And meat load up your blood system with proteins and make it very heavy and sluggish.
Because blood is so rich in iron, mortal humans can only ingest a small amount without getting sick, let alone survive on it.
What is the biology of an animal that actually survives on blood? The vampire bat is a good example. And so I looked at their physiological structure. How do they drink it? How do they take it in? How does their system actually work on it? What kind of nutrients are extracted from blood through their particular system?
Blood is so high in iron content that vampires consume as much as 800 times more than an average human. Evidence suggests that vampire bats have a highly efficient mucous membrane along the intestinal tract that prevents too much iron from getting into the bloodstream. But unlike the vampire bat, immortal beings can only thrive on the blood of one species, humans. According to the American Red Cross, there is currently no replacement for human blood. Animal blood won't do, and at least for now, human blood can't be manufactured. Within some clans, blood exchange is done regularly, but because of blood-borne diseases, it can be dangerous. So many modern-day vampires have monogamous relationships, at least as far as their blood partner is concerned.
I take apart a little tiny piece of a human into myself, and this human must be very, very special and very unique before I would do such a thing.
When the vampire is taking the blood. They're taking not just life essence, they're taking something about the person into themselves. They're taking that heartbeat, they're taking what makes that person an individual, a human, and they're drinking that into themselves.
Many in the vampire subculture wear a special symbol that identifies them to others of the same kind.
Let's face it, you don't want to go around discussing blood or cutting people up just to anybody in a bar.
And you won't find vampires and werewolves congregating in those same clubs or bars.
Your snooty gothic attitude is, oh, we don't run with those dogs. And the attitude primarily of the pack here is vampires. You know, we have a name for vampires here in New Orleans. And they say, what is that? And we say, lunch.
Gypsy Zanbar is a New Orleans resident and a local leader of the Lycans.
It was always here before I came, but I started bringing it out into the open. I was eventually put into a position of power. I was given this ring, which has the ankh, and it was handmade for me. It's a symbol of the ruling class of werewolf.
Gypsy believes that he suffers from a hereditary condition, one with no medical cure.
I warn people about it. I tell them, you know, basically don't make me angry. You won't like me very much when I'm angry.
For centuries, the moon has been blamed for causing the transformation, and plenty of scientific evidence exists to support its powerful effect.
Even a man who is pure of heart, says his prayers, can become a wolf man if he's bitten in the light of the full moon.
One study has asserted that changes in the brain's electrical activity coincide with lunar phases. Other researchers claim that the body's metabolism increases during the full moon. Police often note that especially violent crimes seem to occur more frequently during periods of full moon. But the essential shape-shifting nature of werewolves has defied science for centuries. Like vampires, it is assumed that lycans suffer from a genetic mutation either inherited or acquired through a viral infection.
It's a genetic disorder. All the way back on both sides, Romanian Gypsy descent. All the way, traceable all the way to Vlad Dracu.
Some, like Gypsy, explain the condition as being related to the level of adrenaline in the bloodstream. According to this theory, werewolves react strangely to surges of adrenaline, almost as if they have an allergy, swelling up and undergoing a physical change. But few first-hand descriptions of the actual transformation have been documented, until now.
From personal experience, what happens to me is that I start feeling a swelling or a tightening of the muscles. Usually around the chest area is where it starts. People notice a physical change in the color of my eyes. My eyes, which are normally hazel green, will go to a goldish or a yellow when this reaction happens. My feet and hands actually form rough pads, much like an animal. My muscles swell.
I also have heard from family individuals who the person suffers from lycanthropy, but the family does lock them in a room for the 4 or so many days of the full moon, and then they release them at that time.
The after effects of the transformation are not pleasant.
The next day, everything goes back to normal. Now you've got these muscles that have been stretched beyond capacity. Just like working out with weights or anything else and performing muscle strain. Very hard to move, you're tired, and afterward you feel like you've been run over by a dump truck. It's terrible. It's not something I want to go on the 6 o'clock news and morph out and then do this in 3 shows a day for Vegas or something, just as a novelty, because it is physically demanding. It hurts, and I like myself a lot. I don't like to hurt me.
As a leader of the Lycan community, Gypsy serves as a role model and resource for others.
There are people out there that have a nature they don't understand. They run for it because of society. I'll be more than happy to tell them, look, you can cope with this nature. They're afraid of what they're becoming. They're afraid of what they'll do.
But this lichen underworld remains secretive. For there are those who would destroy any werewolves they could find, vampires carrying out the age-old vendettas, and other hunters who use both traditional weapons and modern technology in an attempt to eliminate the undead.
I'll have to run a few tests. It's definitely an irradiated fluid of some sort.
Ultraviolet ammunition.
Daylight harnessed as a weapon.
As long as there have been werewolves and vampires, there have been those who have hunted them.
There's a long tradition of vampire hunters.
The early church, the medieval church, had employed full-time werewolf hunters, witch hunters, vampire hunters, full-time torturers, and full-time woodcutters for the stakes.
In European tradition, locals would often hire a dhampir, the offspring of a vampire and a human, to track down and destroy a vampire.
Here, dhampirs were very real. They had special powers as hunters.
Dhampirs have disappeared in the mists of time. But many of the techniques and weapons they used to ward off and kill vampires have been passed down through history. European thinking associated vampires with Satan, so a religious symbol like the crucifix with its heavenly power was thought to repel the beast. But modern-day werewolves or vampires have little fear of these icons.
And with that power, you will be destroyed.
The vampire's far bigger than Christian mythology. And so you have modern vampires who don't have any problem with the cross, who are not particularly affected by Christian symbols, drink holy water.
And today, few would imagine that garlic would work against the powers of the undead.
The garlic that the vampire hunters used around their neck was not to repel the vampire, but to repel the smell of death as they were opening up these caskets.
To actually kill a vampire, you must track it down and destroy it in person. Traditionally, vampire hunters seek out their prey as it lies dormant in its tomb.
You're not trying to find a living person. You're going to the graveyard, and what you're looking for there is dead. You're looking for a disturbed grave. You're looking for a corpse that has not decayed properly or has not decayed at all, or that looks swollen and seems to have blood still within it. You're looking for a corpse that seems to have moved in the coffin. Those are the signs you're looking for.
Driving a stake through the heart has been one of the major methods of killing vampires for hundreds of years.
The notion being that if you destroy the heart, that's the thing that actually pumps the blood, you destroy the vampire.
After being staked, a corpse is often decapitated and the dismembered body incinerated to ensure there is no physical form that can heal itself and return from the dead. According to tradition, vampires can also be destroyed by the sun. Throughout history, hunters have found ways to harness light as a weapon against the undead. Vampires are vulnerable as they habitually retreat to their daytime resting place. But a werewolf is never dormant, and there is rarely a time you can catch them completely off guard. Due to their ability to regenerate physical tissue, lichens are mostly immune from injury and physical disease. However, they can be killed by any wound that damages the heart or the brain beyond repair.
It's the same with a werewolf. You would stake, but you would then cut off the head and burn the body.
Tradition holds that shooting a werewolf with a silver bullet is the only infallible method of killing it.
The full moon is the time of the werewolf. The silver bullet, silver is the moon metal. It has a relationship with the light of the moon, the silver light of the moon. So therefore you take these two things together and you use the magical connection to forge a weapon that can kill this creature, which operates only at the time of the full moon.
We can only imagine, however, that vampires and werewolves have utilized cutting-edge technology to improve these age-old tools, creating sophisticated weapons that use silver and light.
Silver nitrate.
Lethal dose.
They won't be able to dig these out like they do with their usual rounds.
Straight into the bloodstream. Ain't nothing to dig out.
Ultimately, The best hunters of the undead are the undead themselves. In their age-old battle for dominance of the underworld, they have surely become well practiced at seeking out and destroying each other. Look at the people around you. They may well be more than just ordinary mortals. But approach the undead with caution, for the hunter often becomes the hunted. Enter the underworld at your own risk. And when the battle begins, which side will you choose?